Maya was founded in 1993 and listed on the Air share market in 2012. Maya is China's leading high-tech enterprise focusing on the R&D and manufacturing of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. Maya is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, KFS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series, CG.A series, M series, XS series, XM series, XL series, etc. The whole scene sorting solution can be provided to raw cashew separation, whole cashew separation, split separation, broken pieces separation, tester separation, scorched separation, medium spot separation, shell separation, foreign material separation, and so on. Maya brand new cashew color sorter, equipped with AI deep learning technology based on massive cashew sorting data, can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of micro-color difference, mold and spores, which are difficult to solve with traditional color sorters, significantly improving the sorting efficiency and impurities such as single spot, multiple spot, micro-color difference, skin, insect spots, mold and wrinkled skin of cashew kernels. In addition, based on engineering design and intelligent manufacturing, the structure of the whole machine is highly standardized and modularized, which greatly enhance the stability and reliability. Maya is dedicated to creating more value for cashew processors.
try to add in. So what I've added in here is the FOB price of 320s, just to look at this gap. The gap between the general RCN cost and 320s before the bubble, in this period of very fast growth in the market, and the situation now. And although that's not, mathematically exactly correct, it gives us a very strong indication of how this situation, where margins for processors have tightened, how that's come about. So we're looking at key factors. Volatility of freight, higher freight in recent years. We're looking at more and more competition as demand in India grows. And it's difficult to compete with India because market prices for kernels in India are higher, the market is protected, and demand is growing quickly. As Indian processors get more competitive, as they apply technology themselves, that situation is likely to increase. And we've also seen that India's area planted to cashews hasn't been growing quickly, so we shouldn't expect fast growth in production in India for the foreseeable future. So we're looking at a situation where competition actually intensifies for raw cashew nuts. We're also looking at governments in African countries introducing and increasing export taxes and the introduction of minimum farm gate prices over the last 10 years. All of those factors have had a big impact in increasing costs and in tightening margins. At the same time, as we've seen, production has increased. So we're looking at a very difficult situation, increasing costs, no advantage from increasing production, and this is the reason why RCN prices make a much poorer match with kernels prices in recent years. Add to that distant markets, so supplying from Vietnam to the Middle East or to Europe or to North America is key. But those are very distant markets. So higher costs, freight costs particularly, influence that too. Higher costs of bringing the raw cashew nuts to the processing areas and then higher costs of bringing the kernels back have a huge influence. Add to that changing buyer needs. I've just put a sustainability symbol in there to signify that. So buyers look much more now at the story behind their products. They're looking for traceability. They're looking for sustainable cashew kernels. And this is also causing problems in Vietnam in terms of the thinking and the organization of the sector. So let's have a look at these 4 pillars of the success of Vietnam: the low processing cost, the use of technology, competitiveness on price, and the ability to mix and match quality, cater products for particular markets. And some of these factors are being undermined. So the low processing cost, although processing costs are incredibly low in Vietnam, they're being undermined by the rising supply chain costs and by the fall in the quality of raw cashew nuts. So although your processing cost can be very low, if you're paying more to bring that product to your processing plant, and if it's a lower quality, therefore with a lower outturn, therefore with a higher breakage, when it gets there, that undermines your competitiveness. We look at the technology. Vietnam is by far the leader in technology, but that technology is also available to competitors, as we've seen. Is there another big breakthrough? Maybe. Is there a fully automated plant in the offing? Possibly. Would be a huge investment, of course. It would need another big breakthrough in technology to re-establish that advantage. Meantime, Indian technology, to a lesser extent, Chinese technology in cashew processing is developing. we look at the mix and match and the price factors together. So what we've seen is, until now, demand has responded to lower prices. We saw that last year. But kernels prices haven't really, I mean, even with the recent steady kernels prices, we couldn't really call that a response to these low prices. We're looking at, well, up to 2 weeks ago, we're looking at 14-year lows on cashew kernels prices. We haven't seen the response until the second half of last year, perhaps, in demand that you would have expected. If you think about the mix and match quality, which has been really successful strategy, you got to ask the question, how low you can go. I mean, you can't keep diluting quality and expect prices to rise. If at the same time, better quality, nearer to the markets is developing as it is in West Africa, if that becomes increasingly available, this can undermine this strategy. And here we have the conundrum. So if we take the example, so Vietnamese buyers, or Vietnamese processors, excuse me, have managed to successfully dominate the US market, for example. They have been able to reduce price and match quality accordingly. How do they now convince American buyers to pay more for a higher quality product? It's very, very difficult to see that happening. And this is where you're going to get, I think, a conflict, particularly in the US market. And I think it's one of the reasons why African cashew kernels have made less progress in the US market than in the European market. And I think it's secondly a reason why US demand has responded, of all markets, the most slowly to lower prices. US demand is very slightly up last year compared to Europe, with strong growth in imports. So what we've got is we're looking at a situation where the original foundations of the success of Vietnam are being undermined by market conditions and market developments. Now, how might Vietnamese processors and the sector in general respond to that? I think there's a number of ways. Firstly, they can respond with low cashew prices to build demand and squeeze competitors. Well, actually, they've already done that. That's really what's been happening over the last 3 years. Secondly, developed two-tiered kernels prices, which can help to keep RCN prices low. Both short-term strategies. And thirdly, add more value. And that too is happening. And there's a lot of talk about that. And I picture products which are packed in Vietnam for a US retailer. So if we look at these possible responses, lower kernels prices works. But if you saw our webinar last November, I think it was the 29th of November, you can look it up on YouTube if you'd like. The idea of lower kernel prices to build demand and squeeze competitors, it works if you can have a vibrant forward market with forward market premiums. So you can sell forward, pressure the RCN market based on lower priced early shipment, prompt shipment kernels and keep those two in line. It works. It gets interrupted by the growth of processing in competing countries. The two-tiered kernels market. So we've seen this big gap between the lowest price and the highest price of 320s, for example. That too has worked quite well for a period. But it could frustrate the value-added strategy, because if you're looking to add value, if you're looking to offer a quality product, you need to have a reputation for quality. This is going to ask questions around about food safety and ask questions around about quality. And secondly, the two-tiered kernels market doesn't at all manage the competition for RCN from India, because the Indian kernels market is something unto itself, trading at much higher prices. So the third option is, of course, the most constructive. Third option is to add more value. Now that means potentially lower volume. Make more money on lower volume would be the option. It means challenges of food safety, getting factories into a position where they can build the confidence of retailers and buyers at destination for consumer packed products like the ones you see in the picture. But it doesn't solve issues of traceability or sustainability, because we're still looking at moving up to 3 million tons of raw cashew nuts halfway around the world every year. So what we've seen happening is that a trading strategy based on selling forward and then filling in with RCN based on a spot or prompt market, which is lower, that's frustrated by minimum pricing at origin, rising prices, and of course, if the market turns and we get rising prices, in a situation therefore that your forward sales are sold below the current market price, the whole strategy would collapse. So now we're at a situation where kernels prices are low, there's no more opportunity to undercut the price without continuing to lose money. Demand is responding to lower prices, and now you get the difficult decisions for Vietnam as an industry and for Vietnamese processors. And I think they're aware of it. And this is just an example of a report from a publication in Vietnam which reports a discussion on how these factors are playing out. And I've put a link in there, so when this is eventually circulated, you can have a look at that article yourself. So there is an awareness in Vietnam of this situation. I think that we should recognize Vietnam is a highly successful cashew processing country. It's highly adaptable. There will be a coherent response. There's no doubt that Vietnam will not lose its cashew industry, but it may change it. And how that response evolves is going to have a huge influence on what happens elsewhere, particularly in West Africa. So if Vietnam, for example, goes for high value addition strategy with less volume, then there needs to be processing elsewhere. And at the moment, that would appear to be West Africa. So look at the situation carefully, listen to what's happening in Vietnam. Very interesting situation evolving. So moving on quickly, let's have a look at some of the news stories that were around in the cashew business over the last couple of weeks. I highlight 3 food safety issues. Salmonella in one case from the United States, a mislabeling issue elsewhere in the United States, and also a certification issue from Saudi Arabia. I highlight these not because they're huge or influential events in the market, but I highlight them because I wanted to point out just how important food safety certification is when we talk about the cashew business, and particularly when we talk about value-added cashews. These factors in the United States may well damage demand in the short term. And usually what happens in these cases is that it doesn't just damage demand for the retailers in question or their suppliers, Trader Joe's in one case, Walmart in another. It tends to damage demand right across the sector. So that's something that may well slow the response to the lower prices in the US again this year. Another story which I thought was quite interesting is this one from Vietnam, where the authorities are now beginning to look at certification, and they're beginning to look at what's described in this article as self-styled organic certification. And the impact of incorrect, improper, perhaps fraudulent in some occasions, certification in particular segments, particularly organic. And Vietnamese authorities have said that they're going to fix this situation, and let's hope they do so. that would explain some of the conflict in the organic market we sometimes see, where there's a huge price differential between certain suppliers and others. By the way, I'm not suggesting that all suppliers in Vietnam are part of this. They're not. Many suppliers are properly certified, but there are some that are not. If we look at other stories, some good news stories from West Africa, a new factory established in Ghana, said to be 12,000 tons capacity, and a new factory estimated at 10,000 tons capacity in the Republic of Guinea. It just goes to show that there are continuing developments. So let's look back on our market key points. Crops, so far actually so good, but potential weather problems needs to be watched closely. Demand is steady, it's been picking up. Inventories of kernels, much more like normal now. Inventories of RCN, probably we can say the same thing. The calculation, raw cashew nuts compared to kernels, well, margins are appearing in some areas. It's not quite resolved yet. Kernels prices are probably still a little bit too low. Maybe RCN prices are still a little bit too high too, but it is moving in the right direction. Discounted sellers or sellers that have high costs in processing remain in a difficult position, and that's not going to change in the short term. Outlook, from my point of view, I think the kernels price remains steady. I think demand remains good. We may see an improvement in kernels prices as the year goes on. RCN prices, well, I think that they might slip in the international market, drop off a little in the coming weeks if there are no crop issues proven. Now, you know, obviously if there was a big issue with the crops anywhere, particularly big producers, Cambodia, Cote d'Ivoire, India, if there were big problems in any of those countries, all bets are off and we're looking at an entirely different situation. But right now I'm thinking we're not probably looking at that. We're looking at late, maybe a little bit smaller than hoped for, but a crop that probably is adequate to meet demand this year. But let's watch it closely. We leave the market for now and we'll look at our country profile for this week. I'm going to look at Ghana. I was lucky enough to be in Ghana a few weeks ago, get a good understanding for what's going on and the interesting changes in the sector there. First of all, you can see location of Ghana right in the center of West Africa. Somehow you could say Ghana is the crossroads in the cashew sector in West Africa. Ghana is a country of about 34 million people. The area, about 239,000 square kilometers. So if you're in Europe, that's around about the same size as the UK. If you're in Southeast Asia, you might look at that it's about the same size as Laos. And if you're in the US, Ghana is about the same size as the state of Michigan. It's the World Bank ease of doing business is a good way to look at how to transact cashew business in the country. So if we look at Ghana, it's 13th in sub-Saharan Africa, having slipped in recent years. And if we just look at cashew countries, Ghana is about 4th in the cashew countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So it ranks quite highly. Area planted to cashews in Ghana has been rising. The 10-year growth rate to 2022 is over 12%. You can see that the the planted area took something of a jump during the high price period 2016, 17 into 18, but it has steadily grown since then. The rate of growth has been slowing a little bit, but I am told that farmers are still planting cashews despite the lower prices that we've seen over the last couple of years. They're still planting cashews on marginal land, and to a certain extent cashews are going back to their original function in West Africa, which was as a defense against the climate. Nowadays, of course, as a defense against climate change. So I think we can continue to consider that there will be an increase in the planted area. What does that mean for production? So we can see that production in Ghana, and I'm taking the official estimates here rather than any traders' estimates. But if we look at these, this would place Ghana as the 8th largest producer in the world and the 5th in Africa. We're looking at vast production growth over the last 10 years, about 15% per annum. Those trees that were planted are beginning to come to maturity now. So we're seeing increasing production. And the forecast is for about 300,000 tons by 2030. Today's production is estimated by the Ministry of Agriculture at 230,000 tons for 2024. Now we should remember that it's a really difficult country to understand in cashew terms because we have huge flows of cashews through the country. So therefore you get a wide range of production estimates. Some traders put the figure as low as 160,000 tons. The official figure, as I've mentioned, 230,000 tons. What we do see is that production has doubled on these figures since 2019. So there's no disputing the positive upward trend in production. Ghana is known for good quality cashew nuts. So I look at two things. I look at the outturn and the cutting test comparison. Ghana scores very well in the West African context. And we look at the size of the nuts, and we, in both cases, look at a range, the low end and the high end. And in both cases, we find that Ghana, compared to its neighbors, compared to West Africa in general, scores high. In fact, it's in the top 4 in West Africa for both outturn and nut count. So this explains part of the reason why Ghanaian RCN is so sought after, particularly in the early parts of the year. Now, what really makes Ghana different to any other country in West Africa is the transit trade. And this trade is growing. So you can see in this map, the black arrows represent trade which is generally legal and which is generally from landlocked countries to ports at the coast. But there are also red arrows, and the red arrows would be illegal trade from Cote d'Ivoire into Ghana, and you can see, for example, Guinea-Bissau also into Senegal. This transit trade is growing. It is difficult to record, and it is quite poorly recorded at this stage, and it has had an impact on the reputation of Ghanaian cashews from time to time, particularly in Vietnam, where it's often been pointed that the quality of Ghanaian cashews has been falling, but that is not clear because it may be that those are actually nuts that came through in transit, but were shipped and imported at the other end as being of Ghanaian origin. If we look at the extent of this, so what I did was I took the recorded imports in India and Vietnam and compared it to the actual production in Ghana. And what you see that a lot of material is landing in Vietnam and India as origin of Ghana, based on the port it was shipped from, far higher than the production. So you can see how this situation arises in terms of the danger to the reputation of Ghanaian grown RCN and the impact. Now that creates a huge opportunity, of course. There's great trading opportunities. The ports, the trucking companies, managers, warehouses benefit by that. And it also potentially creates an additional supply source for processors in Ghana. But it also causes a certain amount of distortion, particularly in the reputation of the country for quality, particularly in the recording of origin at destination. And there are probably instances in there too where buyers become frustrated because they expect to receive material of one quality, but they receive a different quality, and that leads to a lot of disputes and discussions and allowances, as anyone in the RCN trade has experienced. So it is, I think, reasonable to say also that some of the practices in this transit trade mitigate against the development of processing in the country. It is very difficult to build your supply chain in such a fluid situation. And we are seeing regulatory measures that will change that and will improve that. I'll come to those in a few minutes. Before we do that, let's have a quick look at processing in Ghana. Ghana's not made the kind of progress that its neighbours have in processing. You can see the installed capacity, on paper at least, has remained relatively static, and the utilisation of that capacity, although it is improving, it has improved in 2023, it will improve again in 2024, this has also remained relatively low. Uzibras is the only real modern major processor in the country. There is this new factory that's mentioned. Hopefully we'll get some more information on that in the weeks to come. Meantime, the mid-range and the smaller processors, they do operate, but it's a real struggle. And that there are interesting features. I visited a factory that was making a really nice consumer product for the domestic market, very nicely packed, lovely quality product. And so there are some positive signs in amongst this difficult situation. But Ghanaian processing has not made the progress expected. If you had looked at this 10 years ago, you would have said, okay, Ghana is the place to go to build processing in West Africa. Clearly that's changed. Cote d'Ivoire has dominated the development of processing. So despite better quality, despite increasing production, despite the large volume throughput in the transit trade, despite better ports, processing has just not taken off yet in Ghana, but that may change. There is a new sector policy under the Tree Crops Development Authority that will support processing, and there is the World Bank sponsored cooperation with the government and agencies of Ghana, the Tree Crops Development Project, and that is going to make some big changes in the cashew sector. Just to give you a flavour of what is happening and what may happen, the Tree Crops Development Authority is supporting, with other agencies in the country, the development of production and improvement of quality. Actors in the trade, particularly raw cashew nut traders, are being licensed. There is now support developing for processing, support for quality standards. Minimum pricing has been introduced, but it is functioning more as a minimum price. It's not seeking to drag prices higher. It's functioning as a floor price, and there is a mechanism to establish that in place. There is a plan to improve the level of market information, the records, to improve the regulation of the raw cashew nut trade. And although it's not official, I'm wondering if there may be a chance that an export tax on raw cashew nuts could be introduced in Ghana next year or the year after. To me, it certainly would seem to make some sense. We will see. So key points for Ghana. Firstly, production is increasing and it's going to continue to increase. Secondly, regulation. The new agency, the new authority, the Tree Crops Development Authority, and the projects it's entered into are changing the sector and changing the sector for the better, in my opinion. We should expect processing to increase in the country in the coming years. So quite a positive outlook, but that's not to say that some of the problems facing the management of the sector, particularly the fact that so much raw cashew nuts flows through the country, it's not grown there. There are some challenging issues to be resolved in the coming years. But generally, it's looking really positive for the future of the Ghanaian cashew sector. Our final topic today is to have a look at the idea of sustainable cashews from Africa. This arises from some work done by the African Cashew Alliance, by some questions raised the last time we spoke on this event, and by a general increased interest in sustainability. We've seen, for example, higher prices for cashew kernels from West Africa. That is in part related to the overall sustainability of cashews from the region. So we're going to have a look at some of the factors that make African cashew kernels sustainable, particularly focused on West Africa. So the first area is location, and location gives permanent advantage. Being closer to markets means lower freight cost, it means shorter lead times, it means that buyers need to carry less inventory, obviously reducing their cost. It gives a longer shelf life on the products that are arriving. And of course, the kernels are fresher and tend to be better because they're recently processed. This huge factors in terms of permanent advantages simply by location. Now, they don't apply as advantages for all markets. Clearly, these factors do not apply as an advantage if you're supplying the Chinese market, but they certainly would apply if you're supplying the European market or the North American markets. Important permanent advantages which make West African kernels sustainable in the context of those markets. The argument for East African kernels would also be there, but just to a slightly lesser extent due to location. Secondly, let's look at some aspects of the carbon footprint of the cashew business. So if we look at the journey of raw cashew nuts from West Africa, and granted, I'm taking the most extreme case here because we're talking about West Africa. And if we take an outturn of net outturn around about 20% for the purpose of the calculation, 16,350 kilometer journey to Vietnam, processed, and then a journey of about 17,000 kilometers back to markets in Europe. So this case is developed based on Côte d'Ivoire raw cashew nuts processed in Vietnam and consumed in Germany. That adds up to a per ton journey of just under 100,000 kilometers, based on the fact that you have to move 5 tons of raw cashew nuts to get 1 ton of kernels. That means that origin processed African cashew kernels travel 7.5 times shorter a distance than African raw cashew nuts processed in Vietnam and re-exported. Obviously, that reduces the carbon footprint. It reduces the supply chain handling operations, and I'm just talking about counting the number of operations rather than anything more sophisticated. It reduces the actual handling operations by about 70%. There are 70% fewer operations involved in a direct export of a processed kernel, processed at origin. Now, this argument applies for origin processed kernels. So it also applies for Cambodian cashews processed in Cambodia, Vietnamese cashews processed in Vietnam. It's not just about African cashew kernels, but it is most evident in African cashew kernels because about 58% of the world's cashews grow in Africa, but less than 10% of those are processed there. Key factor too is that today, the process anywhere in the world, the process in a West African country compared to the process in Vietnam is pretty much the same process. And that means, of course, that there's no real difference in the carbon footprint of the actual process. It's the same process. So that's the second factor in sustainable African cashews, the carbon footprint. And if we look at the market share, so Europe, about 80% of our kernels are sourced in the less sustainable method, in the higher carbon footprint method, and about 90% of the US cashews are sourced in this way. Third factor is the ability to meet legislative requirements, and I've just picked two. First of all, we've seen developments in the law in European countries in particular. In Germany with the German Supply Chain Act and the European Commission of the European Union, the proposal for a directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, as they call it, never use simple words when you can use complex ones. But what it means is that only origin processed cashews can meet the full requirements. Doesn't mean only African, it means only origin processed can meet the full requirements. We're talking about tracing the product right back to the farm gate. We're talking about its social impact. We're talking about assessing all of those factors. And that's just not possible in the international trade in raw cashew nuts. Secondly, and this is specific to African kernels, the lower use of pesticides and herbicides by smallholders in Africa reduces the risk of exceeding maximum residue levels. And this particularly, again, is focused on the European market. That's the logo of the European Food Safety Authority. So this is another aspect that it's more sustainable in meeting legislative requirements, which are themselves based on creating sustainable supply chains. And then we come to those supply chains and we talk about traceability, we talk about sustainable supply chains. And I think what we look at in West Africa right now is a sustainable supply chain. It is a smallholder supply chain. That's not going to change. But within that smallholder supply chain, there is an opportunity for huge social impact. There's an opportunity to provide real farm gate traceability and risk mitigation that goes with that traceability. Genuine supply chain certification. And we talked earlier about the focus and that article talking about supply chain certification in Vietnam, for example, in organic. And when we look at this, we can see that the 3 million tons that is traded of RCN loses its identity. And it's a trader-driven chain, and that is not in conformity with trends in traceability and supply chain management as we see them. Finally, the fifth factor is the opportunity for social impact and social justice, recognizing that cashews are grown by subsistence smallholders. They're not grown on large plantations. Often, as in the past, as in 400 years ago when cashew trees were introduced, they were introduced as a defense against encroachment of the desert, of difficulties for other crops caused by the climate. That is a greater issue now than ever. So now we see mixing of cashews with cocoa, for example, as a result of climate change. And this returned to the original role. So there is an opportunity in cashews in African countries to make an impact in terms of the society and in terms of social justice within that society. So the key points on sustainability for me, based on smallholder production, based on the organization of the supply chain, based on the modern processing that now is common in African countries, and based on the permanent advantages of location, particularly related to markets in Europe and North America, we see these factors. We see opportunity for climate change mitigation, a lower carbon footprint, a responsible supply chain, and impact on society and an impact on the level of social justice. All of those things also coincide with requirements of buyers, legal and others, for traceable cashews with shorter lead times, lower risk of exceeding maximum residue levels, and fresh, sustainable, longer shelf life cashews. So the question asked last time we spoke, is it just a case of over-promoting Africa using sustainability arguments? I don't think so. I think these are genuine and strong points in terms of the African cashew sector and the sustainable African cashew kernels. So let's have a quick recap on today's main points, the key points that we've talked about today in the different areas. In terms of harvest and production, I'm still saying so far the crop looks okay. Yes, it's late. We should be watching the weather, and there's some concern over very hot weather in some countries. Market trends, kernels are steady. Premiums are widening. Premiums for top quality forward shipment versus prompt lower quality, those are widening. That may be a sign of prices strengthening. Raw cashew nuts, the farm gate is weaker this year. Farm gate prices are weaker this year, and this may still influence international traded prices. In our analysis section, we talked about Vietnam's conundrum, and we basically came to the conclusion that the model that has served Vietnam so well now needs to be realigned with buyers' needs and current market developments, particularly competition from India, the access to technology that has developed, and changing quality requirements of buyers. We looked at Ghana in our country profile section. We talked about increase in production and the potential for increased processing. Watch carefully the regulatory and support developments in Ghana that may well see processing develop relatively quickly in the country. And our final subject on our sustainability section, we talked about sustainable cashews from Africa and concluded looking at the factors. My conclusion is that right now, West African cashews in particular are the most sustainable option for European and US buyers. Some are acting on that, and that's where we're seeing the more buying interest and a developing price premium for some well-qualified suppliers from the region. Those are the main points from today. Thank you very much for your time. I'm going to hand you back to Ernest now, and let's see if there are any questions or points to be raised. Ernest.
Thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick. Always with very in-depth information, and the participants are really appreciative from the comments I have here. Actually, the first one is saying that very much appreciated the in-depth look at Ghana. Can we have the same for Cote d'Ivoire and other countries in each edition? I think you looked at Ghana and Vietnam. So it's also the question whether for the subsequent editions, we can also have in-depth look into other countries. So I think that, Jim, is something that can be always arranged.
No, it's already arranged. As I said during the talk, we did Cote d'Ivoire, we did Cambodia last time. This time it's Ghana. Every week we will look at one or two countries and give a profile on them.
Okay. Then there's a question. I take one also on the Zoom. Let me state here that the recording will be taken off shortly. So anybody who wants to ask a question, you can just use the raised hand feature, and then we will allow you to
recording stopped.
Yes, and to have your audio on and to ask your question, or to even use a video if you want to share your face. So here the question is saying, with the modernization of African processing, how has per kilo processing cost developed, and how does it now compare to Vietnam? And then the question is, how is intercropping developing in West Africa? I think you touched a bit on the first part of the question on how the processing cost in West Africa or even in Africa compares to Vietnam. Maybe you have to go over it again, and then also address the issue of intercropping in West Africa.
I have heard of only one factory so far that has matched Vietnamese costs of processing, which is quite an achievement. Most factories can be competitive because their cost of assembling the product, the raw material that is much lower, but their processing costs tend to be higher. So I have heard costs, let's say within the region of $350 to $460 per raw cashew nut ton in West Africa, a little bit higher in East Africa. But if we consider those levels, and then we consider the cost of assembling the product, so let's say it costs $100 per ton to bring the product to the factory, but about $300 per ton to bring it to India or Vietnam. What we're seeing is that the combination of the two, the supply chain cost plus the processing cost, can make processing competitive. However, I would still say that in most cases, the actual cost of processing within the factory in African countries remains higher. And that's for a number of reasons. They're relatively new factories. It takes a number of years to become really efficient. Secondly, the utility costs, things like electricity, are higher. The cost of money is higher. And this is all contributing to an overall level of costs. But it's not necessary to be at the same level of cost as Vietnam. That's an ambition, but it's not necessary because the supply chain costs in assembling the product are much lower.
Okay.
And that's how that balance of competitiveness can currently be established. In terms of intercropping, I'm not the one to ask about intercropping. Really, I'll tell you a couple of things I've heard. I have heard of more recently cashew trees being used as shade for cocoa trees due to climate change factors. I think that's really interesting. I know that intercropping is a normal and regular feature of growing cashews, particularly in the early years until the canopy closes.
Okay.
Ernest.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next question, if you answer, you have to even produce more names, because somebody wants to know what is the best company for or to purchase latest cashew processing technology. I think here we have to exercise caution in saying that this is the best company or that is the best company. But Jim, your take on this one?
My take on that one is that I'm not going to answer that question on a public forum. And besides, that question is a question that can only really be answered with a whole range of qualifications. What I would say to the questioner is, look, feel free to contact me. You'll see my contact details on the screen. Feel free to contact me and I'll give you a couple of opinions and pointers on that one. But it wouldn't be fair without a really exhaustive study. And maybe that's something that should be done again. We did this way back in 2012. There was a good study published. But it's not something that I'm not going to mention names of suppliers on this forum. But contact me and I'll give you some opinions.
Very good. Yeah, I think we have to be cautious because there are different technologies for different scenarios and the rest. So we always want to avoid that. And maybe as
I suppose what we could say, Ernest, that it's really important to research what you're buying, to research how it suits your situation in your own business in terms of cost, in terms of volume, in terms of your capacity to manage. What's proven to be problematic has been the supply of spare parts and after-sales service from some suppliers. These are factors that need to be taken into account. It's not just about, what's the fastest machine. It's also about what's the most suited machine to the industry that you intend to establish.
Let me remind you that the next ACA conference, the 18th edition, will take place in Burkina Faso. And it's in September. So we are looking at the 16th to the 21st of September. That week is when we are having the conference, and preparations are well underway, and we expect to see you all there. But Jim, there is a person who wants to know what precisely is meant by the two-tiered kernel prices, which you said Vietnam can use to keep RCN prices low. If you can clarify what is meant by the two-tiered kernel prices.
I mean, there's two aspects to it. First of all, there is the aspect of small, probably less reliable processors offering low prices for prompt shipment, and large, reliable suppliers offering higher prices for forward shipment. That's the aspect of one. The second aspect of the two-tier pricing is that the cashew kernels, and I'm going to show you some actually, because I'm going to quickly show you some pictures of some cashew kernels. So these are cashew kernels from retail packs supplied in the United States. And what you see there is a certain specification, and you see a specification that generally is below what we would have considered the usual AFI standard. So what we're seeing is that in order to reach certain price points, the quality is being reduced. And that's fine because it's been reduced. Buyers know this, buyers are aware of that. They're looking at it and they're saying price is really important to us. Can you make us a product that fits a price point? And that means a lower quality. But if you delivered those kernels into a buyer in certain markets in the Middle East, certain buyers in Europe, they wouldn't accept them. And so this is what I mean by the two-tier aspect. There's high quality markets and there are lower quality markets. 20 years ago, there was a specification, usually AFI specification, and there was one spec. Nowadays, we have this evolution of specs, and that's what I mean by the two-tier price quality situation.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. There's a question here. When we discuss acreage, is it the acreage under productive trees or total acreage, including trees that are not yet productive?
So we're talking about the total acreage planted because that's the way the figures are recorded. Therefore, if you see a situation where the acreage is increasing, there's obviously going to be a time lag. So we looked at Ghana, for example, and we saw a big step up in acreage. I think it was 2018. So let's take 2018 plus 3. We see a rise in production. Plus 7, we see that come to maturity and develop from there. So generally speaking, we're talking about actual planted area. It's much more difficult to get reliable figures for what's productive. So what we do is we take the age of the trees and we try and extrapolate from there. So if I present a figure that's total hectares, it means all total hectares, productive and non-productive. Look for the steps up, add on your 3 years for the first crop, maybe 3-4 years, and then 7 years for maturity to get some idea of the trend. Ernest.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim. Let me say that at this point, I need to also recognize our sponsors and partners. And here I'm talking about the European Union, the OACPS, the GIZ Move Cashew, Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and the USAID, as well as also Cashew Info. And we are grateful for your support and partnerships. Jim, I don't see any further questions here, also online. And I want to ask you what the next focus will be for the next GME and when you are likely to have the next GME.
Well, I'm going to look out for these talking points over the next 2 weeks, first of all. First question is, how is the weather? How are the high temperatures? Are they damaging the crops? Secondly, look out for the situation in Benin. It's going to have a big influence on the market there. When will the regulations come out? What will they be? Keep an eye on this situation, the relationship between the raw cashew nuts and the kernels. My question is this mismatch over? Probably not, but I think it's on the way. Keep an eye on that. How will the crops in Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, and the Gambia evolve as they start to come online in the coming weeks? Key factor, India's crop. We saw an optimistic estimate from the authorities in India, 782,000 tons crop. Will that come to fruition? If it doesn't, how will Indian processors react in the market? And of course, what will cashew buyers do in the coming 2 weeks? Now, it's going to be a period of holidays in Europe and the United States, so I don't think we're going to see too much activity there, but we may see something. Next time, Ernest, you asked me what are we going to talk about. We're looking at the 10th of April, in 2 weeks. We're going to talk about markets, as always. Our profile will be of the Benin cashew sector. Our analysis will be the impact on cashew demand of prices and vice versa. And our feature on sustainability will focus on organic cashews, and we'll ask the question, is organic certification the answer? Thanks very much to everyone who joined us today. Thank you particularly to anyone who asked a question. I'm looking forward to coming back to you talking about these points on the 10th of April. Thank you very much, Ernest.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thanks to our participants. There's one last question though, but I think it is something that you will take it on board for the next session, that you have been studying the cross-border trades in the, I think, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Gambia, and when you will be sharing some information on that. So I think this is something for the research for the coming editions. And on that note, thank you to everyone who made this possible, viewers, Jim Fitzpatrick, our interpreters, our team back stage, and also our sponsors and everyone. I say thank you very much and see you once again on the 10th of April, 2024. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Take care. Bye.